Good afternoon, Chautauqua. I have a feeling I know what brings you here today, to hear a fantastic speaker. And I'm Eugene Sutton, senior pastor here at Chautauqua Institution, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Hall of Philosophy for the 2026 Interfaith Lecture Series. This week, we host an all-star cast of American religion experts. We've had Randall Balmer, today Najeeba Syeed, tomorrow Terrence Johnson, and Thursday E.J. Dion. Each of these three are at the top of their fields, and it's our great honor to host them. Before introducing our speaker today, I want you to please consult the Chautauquan Daily newspaper, the paper of record, for details about the outstanding and varied programs of the Department of Religion. I would also like to highlight the CHQ Dialogue, discussion groups, Mystic Heart Meditation, Islam 101, Courageous Conversations on Death and Dying, Labyrinth Walk, Palestine Peaks, Palestine Park Tour, and any one of a myriad offerings from our 22 amazing denominational houses and religious organizations. Please remember that tomorrow morning's Thursday morning worship, it will be here in the Hall of Philosophy, and it brings back an old tradition from Chautauqua. Oh no, Thursday is 2 days from now. What year is this? Thursday morning, it features a faith journey conversation with the chaplain of the week, Dr. Michael Chan. And then Friday is our ecumenical communion service here in the Hall of Philosophy, along with the practices in worship held most dear by our Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, all on Friday having their worship services. Consult the Chautauquan Daily. There is a moderated Q&A following today's lecture, followed by a meet and greet here at the Hall of Missions to my left. Please submit your questions online via questions.chq.org or write on a slip of paper, and ushers will be around if you raise your hand to take your question. Be reminded that the nearest restrooms are underneath this Hall of Philosophy on the Cookman Avenue side facing me, and assistive listening devices are available. For any additional accommodations, please let us know. And now please silence your cell phones and no flash photography, which we haven't had here in years. Now, for those joining us via Chautauqua's YouTube channel, thank you. To view live captions during today's lecture, visit captions.chq.org on any internet-connected mobile device. Today, we're very honored and pleased to have with us Najeeba Syeed. Najeeba Syeed is the Inaugural El-Bibri endowed chair and executive director of the Interfaith Institute, and is a tenured and full professor of religion at Augsburg University. She is also a senior fellow at the Oxford Interfaith Forum. Born in Kashmir and raised in Northern Virginia, she is a graduate of Guilford College in North Carolina, having chosen that Quaker school because of the Quaker traditions of nonviolence and peace, where she majored in psychology, but then went on to earn her degree in law, her JD, from Indiana University. She has served as a visiting professor at Yale University and Mercer University. She's an expert on Muslim-Jewish relations and has worked extensively on Evangelical Christian and Muslim relations throughout the country. She served as Associate Professor of Interreligious Education and Director of the Center for Global Peacebuilding at the Claremont School of Theology from 2010 to 2020. She is the daughter, by the way, of Saeed Syeed, one of the founders of the Islamic Society of North America, he himself having had a PhD in linguistics. Najeeba also brings significant executive experience with organizations as an executive director focused on conflict resolution in community, higher education, and government settings, including the Western Justice Center Foundation and the Asian Pacific American Dispute Resolution Center. In 2021, she served as Chief of Staff to an elected member of the Los Angeles City Council. And today's conversation is made possible by the Gertrude L. Sayre Schroeder Fund. And now please join me in welcoming to the stage Najeeba Syeed.
Thank you. What an honor and pleasure it is to join you all. I was meant to join you 2 years ago, but the Delta outage dealt its blow and kept me both from here and Rwanda, which was following. So I wanted to share today, my talk is about or from the broken heart of democracy. And I'm going to be reflecting on two of my mentors, one who, when he was alive, was very much my mentor. The other, when he was alive, was my mentor through his writing. So the first mentor is Glenn Stassen, who is a Christian ethicist, and he was my mentor while he was alive. The other is Robert Bellah, a sociologist of religion, particularly of religion in the United States. I wanted to offer their voices because I desperately need their voices in this moment, and maybe you do as well. So I wanted to start off with a quote from Glenn, and Glenn says, "The peace builder then is a man or woman who is helping to figure out the conditions of possibility, unity, koinonia, shalom, in between groups, communities." And Glenn, this was from his Formation for Life, Just Peacemaking book, which I also contributed to. And Glenn was the kind of person, when you sent him your article, he would copy edit it for you. And we both shared the fact that we always forgot to teach our own writings in our classes. I don't know if that was part of his militant humility or increased forgetfulness over the years. The other person that I wanted to share or bring this voice into this space was Robert Bellah. And the quote that I have highlighted in one of my articles recently about neighborliness is a lived theology in Minnesota, because for those of you who don't know, Augsburg is located in the largest Somali neighborhood in the world, besides Mogadishu, with the largest number of Somali students of any university, private institution in the state of Minnesota. So Robert Bellah says, "We have a chance for another course. Another role for America in the world depends ultimately on the reform of our own culture. A culture of unfettered individualism combined with absolute world power is an explosive mixture. A few religious voices have been raised to say so. The question of the hour, remember, Dr. Bellah is no longer with us, but he's speaking to us from wherever he may be. I won't speak to that theologically. A few religious voices have been raised to say so. The question of the hour is whether our fellow citizens, much less our leaders, are ready to hear such voices." So I wanted to share and bring to you this notion of the heart of democracy. In the Muslim tradition, for instance, it's really important for us to think about the metaphors for these absolute abstract terms. There's no term more abstracted than peace. So I asked my students, draw me a picture of what peace looks like to you. Whether they're 5 years old or 90 years old, tell me what peace smells like. What does it feel like? We have to take these terminologies like democracy and create some sort of embodied form of what and how they become a practice. So I was going to share 2 poems. Becoming a tenured professor means you can write a book of poetry. And this particular book brings the heart of mothers to this conversation. I have to say that in every conflict, whether it was in South Los Angeles or I was flown into another part of the world, it is the mothers who have lost their children to violence that are the first to cross the lines of difference. So I wanted to bring in that voice of mothers. I think having 2 children of my own who are 18 and 20, and I think this might be the empty nest. Some of you can give me advice after how you navigated that. My daughter's joining UCSB in a couple of weeks, so I wanted to share, and that's really the heart that I bring into this work in conversation with Glenn and Robert that I'll be sharing today. So the first question is, what are humans but our stories? One day, maybe already, they have made a movie of our tragedy, found the right person to play me. Maybe it's going to win an Oscar. Maybe it will trend everywhere. Maybe the brown beauty will look like me on Vogue. Maybe you will read about me in history books. Maybe I will be a rallying cry for new atrocities that must be stopped. Maybe I will be woven into a novel by the author who is writing about us, not of her own people. Maybe my name will be pressed into the lips of people protesting. Maybe. When you could have saved me, why didn't you? When you could have saved me, why didn't you? So the next one is called Holy Books. Holy Books. Dream after dreams of prophets, we waited in haunted crevices from your delivery from evil. The tribes before you were arrogant. They stood up to God, their gold lining rivers of pride. Look up at the sky. Famine is coming. Locusts waiting to roost on your crops. The Pharaoh is looking for your firstborn, a boy in a cradle, his mother unharmed. Every story tells another story buried beneath it. Who lives to tell these tales? Weave them into fabric, yours and mine. These miserly men, their sins, enumerated verse after verse after verse, and yet every lesson is unlearned. New books are written, not in words. New books are written, not in words, but the mother holding her smothered, beloved body, she is a holy text unraveling. So I think one of the lessons we learned in Minnesota is that all of us are holy texts. All of us are theologians. All of us have the agency to take religion and spirituality into a moment. Theology, we think about Rabbi Abraham Heschel, and he talks about the notion of protest was walking, that prayer was a form of protest, that protest was a form of prayer because marching was a form of walking, was a form of prayer. So all of us, whether you have a collar, I don't have a collar, whether you are ordained or not, each one of us has the choice to take on the future of this country. No one of us is too big, no one of us is too small. So one of the things that I learned from both Dr. Bella and Dr. Stassen is that democracy is a spiritual act, not a religious one. It is an act of struggle against the human impulse for domination, isolation, and violence. It must be critical of religion when religion uses politics for domination, isolation, and violence. Democracy is not a religious act. It is a spiritual struggle. Both of these scholars teach us that the heart of democracy is not consecrated to any one religious community, that for democracy to function, it must speak It must be relevant. It must have everyone at the table, whether you show up with the right belief or you show up with no belief. It is a spiritual, humanistic act. It is not a religious one. Once we tie the future of a political reality to one religion, and we see this happening in this moment, and it's not only about the future, but Robert Bellah talks about the politics of nostalgia. And one of the things we have to think about is how we tell the story of this nation. Does it include, as scholars know, more than 25 to 30% of enslaved people brought from Africa that we know were Muslim? The story of Muslims who are writing on slave ships in Arabic. That is the story of America before America was even born. The story of this nation is multi-religious. When we begin to erase the multi-religious history of a nation, we create a future that privileges the reality of only one form of religion. So I truly believe democracy is not a religious act, but it is a spiritual one. And not only is it a spiritual one, but it's an internal spiritual struggle for each religious tradition that comes to the table. Will we be able to be critical of our own religious tradition when it seeks power, when it takes away the capacity for difference and dialogue and dissent and perspectives that are critical, that say, no, whatever that religious tradition is, especially if it is mine, do I speak to when it excludes, pushes out, dehumanizes, takes away the capacity for people to show up as whole persons? That is why I think democracy is a spiritual act of constant rehumanization. It's a constant act of vigilance against the dehumanization of those we don't like in that moment. And in that moment, it could be me. In that moment, it could be you. So it is a constant spiritual act of rehumanization that tells us to go back to our religious texts and struggle with our religious texts, struggle with those that seek religion as a form of tyranny. Every religious tradition warns us, whether it is Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, so many that are not even named in those isms, they remind us every generation of prophetic wisdom. And I wanted to add to that the mother with her smothered child in her lap. That mother is a form of revelation. So we look at the sacred texts of the past and we look at the sacred texts of the moment, the one that are unfolding in the streets of wherever we may be, that it is a constant act of rehumanization. We think about Jewish philosopher Levinas, who says that the act of face-to-face contact is the act of rehumanization. Rehumanization cannot happen when the face of someone is covered and you can't see it. Rehumanization is not possible when borders are constructed with barbed wire that says only the right papers allow for humanity. Rehumanization is not possible when the only value a person has is the amount of money they bring to the table or our economy. Rehumanization is not possible when the decisions made prefer a form of physical ability or privilege, a form of physical ability or mental ability or acuity that is described as the right one. Dehumanization comes in so many forms. So I want to remind us that democracy is a spiritual act and one of constant rehumanization. That means each of us has to have the bravery not to do interfaith dialogue, but to do intrafaith dialogue. What's far more powerful for me is to speak to my community of Muslims. We need to do interfaith dialogue. But are we standing up at the holiday table and having a conversation with those in our own community and tradition that are seeking to utilize religion for dehumanization? I think this is far more a moment for intra-faith dialogue. What does it mean to be American and Christian? What does it mean to be American and Muslim? Are there any exclusivities that are attached to the nationality of this country and religion? Because the ways that we tell our past will determine the future of this nation. The other thing, I shared the story of Glenn editing my articles for this reason, that I think interfaith and intercultural friendships between scholars and lay people and individuals is a cornerstone for building both caring and critical scholarship. It is itself a democratic act. To have the friendships that are seen as dangerous because they are rehumanizing a dehumanized set of individuals. So these friendships can not only be private, these friendships can not only be done behind closed doors, these friendships must be public. These friendships must be ones that we announce to the world that say, it was dangerous for us to be together. It was not appropriate. We cannot accept the inevitability of conflict as a perpetual state of the human condition. Again, democracy is a spiritual act against the notion that there is the inevitability of the dehumanization of others. So even friendship, Glenn saying, no, Najeeba, you need to publish this article. I will copy edit it for you. Another thing that came out of that friendship, for those of you who know Glenn, I think he counted himself as one of the Anabaptists at Fuller Theological Seminary. I had a Quaker education, so we would discuss that. But Glenn would always tell his students, thicken Jesus. That Jesus is an example of a peace builder. Don't become someone who says religion doesn't have a voice at the table. So what he did, in fact, by thickening Jesus, he gave me the thrust to thicken the example of Prophet Muhammad as a peacemaker. So he helped build a hermeneutic of peace building, a lens in which I began to look at my own tradition with confidence to be able to say that I am a Muslim peace builder because of my tradition, not despite it. So out of these friendships and individual teaching at an evangelical college becomes an inspiration for a Muslim scholar to return to her own tradition with the confidence, with the ability, with the lens, with the tools, with the capacity to see her own tradition as peace building. So when we engage in intercultural, interfaith friendships, what we do is we hold the other person to the best of their tradition. We remind each other, whether we're Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, whatever, atheist, whatever belief system you're showing up with, we can remind each other of the best of that tradition. So I wanted to emphasize that because I think a lot of times we see scholarship or scholarly relations as cold, abstract conversations that happen in conferences. But it was a deep, abiding friendship with someone like Glenn that led to some of my scholarship. The last time I saw him, I had a panel on the responsibility to protect as an international doctrine for the justification or the non-justification of intervention in other nations. And what was beautiful about what Glenn said to me in that moment is that, Najeeba, the work that you're doing as, at that time I was a younger Muslim scholar, now I'm the senior scholar at my institution, is he reminded me that the work that we do in the United States in our interfaith work impacts, as Bella said, we have absolute power as a nation. So we, as citizens of the United States, must learn how to be good neighbors, not just to one another in the room, but good neighbors around the world. That we have that responsibility. The third thing that I learned from these two scholars is that community is the way through crisis. We cannot be alone as scholars or activists. And I want to remind us that to be in community is to be in conflict. To be in community is to be in conflict. We cannot expect community to be easy. We cannot expect community to be comfortable. I just wrote a piece in defense of awkward spaces. I used to write about safe spaces. I used to write about brave spaces. We have to be willing to be awkward. Maybe we have to be willing to be challenged, maybe even in moments think about how difficult those conversations are going to be. But we cannot find a way of rehumanizing one for the other if we do not go through that awkward process, if we remain in isolation. So we must embrace conflict. We must embrace conflict. It is a part of how we move to be able to build. And I think about this because a lot of my students are really concerned and often bring to me this notion that, Professor Syeed, I want to always feel safe in a conversation. I want to feel comfortable. The only way we grow as individuals, cultures, and societies is through risky engagement. We can't do a risk assessment that is only for my benefit and what I get out of the conversation. Conversations cannot be merely transactional. They must move to a place of transformational. So during the time that you are here at Chautauqua, if a speaker annoys you for some reason, maybe me, if a speaker irritates you for some reason, if a speaker makes you mad, or maybe someone you meet makes you upset, take a moment, sit with it. And if you're able to have that conversation, I guarantee that that relationship is one that will transform both of you. The other thing I wanted to mention here is getting back to that metaphor that democracy has a heart, and it is bleeding in this moment. Embodied empathy means that altruism is at the heart of democracy. If it becomes a game for fame, personal gain alone, we bring ego into the discourse. We bring ego into the discourse, and our kind, whatever our kind is, and its preservation becomes the object of the preservation of that form of democracy. We create democracy in our own image. If democracy is created in your own image, it is hurting someone. If democracy includes only people that reflect your own tradition, your own community, your own viewpoint, is it really democracy? Is that heart open and full? Thinking about Bella's work on habits of the heart. We live in a moment right now where there is a lot of talk around this notion of suicidal empathy. I think we live in a moment of suicidal apathy. It's not actually the people that are out there in the streets who are expressing concern around an issue. I think it's the far greater apathy and the invisibility of how this moment is impacting so many people. If you are able to be comfortable, if you are able to ignore stories, if you are able to live in a way that's unchanged, you have the capacity to close your eyes. You have the capacity to do as so many within our texts did. It's not those that actually join in the tyranny, it's those that are quiet, those that say nothing. We think about both scholars and people like Bonhoeffer in this moment. And I wanted to take a moment to share with you just a little bit about what's happened in Minneapolis. So for about 2.5 months, I did not feel comfortable leaving the house alone. I had students that carried their papers, still do, are terrified to leave their house without their papers. And I share that story with you because it's not about your political party. It's not about your perspective on a political issue. It's about the story that changed with grandmothers who took young children afraid to go to school and drove them to school. A lot of people use the word protest. We'll be talking about this a little bit later in the evening. I think about it far more as mutual care. People showed up for one another in a place where others were afraid. And they asked the holy and spiritual question, how can I show up for you? How can I show up for you? And you know what's incredible about many of those stories? Many of those grandmothers are still driving those young children to school, but instead of driving to school, they're going and getting ice cream. It's the kind of story where a synagogue and a church join together and raise $1 million to support families who are afraid to leave their homes and to get rent. It's the story of evangelical churches providing hundreds of thousands of meals. It's the story of individuals in Minnesota that were able to raise $8 million in mutual care within weeks. It's the story that I write about and work in where theology became lived, and the theology was one based in the deeply contextual notion of what it means to be Minnesotan. I talk about that in my work because it's so cold where you show up. That's why it seems foreign to talk about it in this moment, but I think it gets cold here too, as we're all sweating. But this idea that one of the reasons that this state has the highest per capita refugee population is because of the Christian heritage of hospitality, whether it was Lutheran, Catholic, and otherwise. Why we have one of the largest Hmong populations, actually the largest in the country as well. This is a state that said, you are welcome here. This is a state that said to be Christian and American is to be hospitable and welcoming. And it wasn't only one form of Christian, it wasn't only one form of political identity. But I want to remind us, as the pastor said this morning, that we can have cultural amnesia. And that's why I bring to you the stories of Glenn Stassen and the stories of Robert Bella and their words, is that there are Christian scholars who are male, who are white, who brought the history and the best of Christianity, because I want Christianity to succeed. I want Judaism to flourish. I want Hindus to have safe places to worship. I want Buddhists to walk with me in safety. I want atheists to be able to run for office and not be blamed and vilified. Mormons, Muslims, and atheists are all vilified the most when we run for office, just so you know. We share that in common, I guess. But that's what I want. And I want that because I believe that this country, in its experimentation of democracy, has the capacity for that spiritual struggle from its founding and in its future. I want that for us. I want that for you. I want the best of our traditions to show up. I will struggle with mine. I ask, will you struggle with yours? Thank you.
Wow. It is now time for our Q&A period after that wonderful, stirring, and insightful message. We recognize that there are many offerings at Chautauqua, so if you must leave now, please do so quietly while we make the turn here. You can submit questions again online through questions.chq.org, Or if you would like to submit a written question, please raise your hand, and one of our ushers or Department of Religion staff will bring you a pencil and a slip of paper. Help. Okay, so questions are pouring in, and let's begin here. Dr. Syeed, you said that what do non-Muslims in America get wrong when talking about Muslims?
I think my favorite one is that we all agree and have the same agenda. It seems very innocuous, but it's actually very dangerous. The trope that all Muslims agree and have one agenda takes us from being a religion to being a political ideology. And that's in fact the justification of many anti-Sharia or anti-Muslim legislation. So it seems very innocuous. And I think it's really funny because one imam says, they think we all agree. We can't even make a line to stand in line for our potlucks during Ramadan. So it's just as an internal joke, we're not that organized. But I do think that that's a very serious issue, is we need to see the diversity of the Muslim community, ethnically, racially, ideologically, and to understand that that vast diversity is the same diversity of any religious tradition. If we don't allow for that diversity, then we impose an external perspective of what it means to be Muslim and then demonize that perspective. So I think just as any tradition, that would be one. And the second is the notion that to be Muslim is to be inherently violent. And inherently in that notion is a form of racism as well. And I just wanted to put that out there because I think one of the things when I work with Muslim high school students, I say, when was the first time you opened the Quran as a young person? Many of them say in elementary school when my teacher said something about all Muslims being violent. So to think about, we're returning to our own text as a justification that we are not violent. What does that do to the internalized anti-Muslim bias that we may be carrying ourselves? So I think those are the two, the notion that Muslims are not allowed to have a religion, they are a unified political ideology, and the second is that Islam and Muslims are inherently violent. All religious traditions have the capacity for violence as they have the capacity for peace. There is no one tradition that has a monopoly on violence and peace. We are all equally able to have those capacities.
What role does social media play in the spiritual act of democracy? You talked about rehumanization, but there's also, many believe, dehumanization happening on social media. Can you comment on the role of social media?
So I think part of the spiritual struggle is a spiritual struggle against algorithms.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I'm actually quite serious. I think what happens is we had hoped that social media, and it has happened, and one of the article that I wrote for Glenn's collection was actually about Muslim women's use of, at that time, Facebook in democracy revolutions in the Arab world. And one of the things that we found is there's certainly ways in which many stereotypes and cosmopolitanisms have developed internationally between people of different religious communities. I think one of the things we have to be really careful about is the misinformation that is now created by AI, and that many of the sources that seem to be doing particularly education on Islam and many of the websites that are doing education on Islam are actually anti-Muslim. And that it's not just the algorithm, but the inability to see the sources of religious literacy. And I think religious literacy is one of the most important ways that we create an antidote to hatred. And much of what we find in information around Muslims that people have access to at best is inaccurate, at worst is deeply dehumanizing.
You spoke about the need for not just safe spaces, but awkward spaces. And one questioner wants to know, what good can come from being in an awkward space?
I would ask that question. I don't know who asked that question, but I would ask that question to that individual. One of the things that I think comes from awkward spaces is that we begin to understand that the fear that we contained in our hearts and in our minds of whomever the other is to us is often self-generated and has nothing to do with that individual. It allows us to see that the awkwardness we feel is not created because we have a different perspective from that individual, because the impulse is to try to get the individual to move to my perspective. And I think this is, in many ways, part of what we learned in Minnesota was to be able to build solidarity at the interfaith level without having to agree on all of our perspectives. I would also say that one of the ways that the comparative theology and comparative religion started was more than 100 years ago with the question of, what does your religion believe about who goes to heaven? That is actually many of the taxonomies that come from seminaries around that time about other religions were about, what do you believe and who's going to go to heaven? If that's the question you start with of other religions, where do we end up with? It seems very innocuous, but in fact, a lot of comparative theology was based on that question instead of the question of how do we build within our common humanity an agenda for making the world a better place. And I wanted to bring to this question of awkward space, I no longer use the word common ground. I no longer have the objective of agreement in conversations. I talk about the notion of common humanity. That's why I do think, again, democracy is not a religious act. It is a spiritual act and a consistent vigilance of spiritual struggle against the elements, some of which can come from religions that dehumanize others.
Is there something inherent in the Abrahamic faiths that want to would like to have their religion be in power as over against others? And I think this writer is talking about many Islamic societies where it's tough to be other, a Jewish nation where it's tough to be other, and in Christianity, the rise of Christian nationalism.
I don't think the Abrahamic religious nationalisms are new. If you look at religious histories or you look at nations, also remember these are some of the new kids on the block. I have to remind people that there are religions that are 10,000 years old that are still in existence. So I just mentioned that because I don't think it's exclusive to Abrahamic traditions. I think this is a consistent struggle of human society in which religions, and it doesn't mean religions as we know them now, but spiritual belief systems can be utilized for either means to include others or means to exclude others. So we can think about mythologies that have existed that predate many of these religious traditions, and those mythologies have created stories that can be interpreted as humanistic and inclusive, or stories that can also exclude others. So I don't think it's particular to the Abrahamic traditions. I think we live in an Abrahamic moment. And I think it's also a good question to ask, what within our tradition, Ibrahim, if Abraham were to walk into any of these spaces, what might have been his perspective on these issues? I would also add his wives as well, because
yes.
Because why not? So why not? And depending on your religious interpretation of sacred texts and who and how, but I do think it's really important to be very careful about creating a unanimity amongst the Abrahamic traditions as well, because there are also traditions that identify as Abrahamic that are not often named. So I do think we have to be very careful with the Abrahamic notion as imposing a uniformity or agreement or consensus as well. The diversity within Islam is vast, so I think it's just very important that when we utilize that term, we are also very careful about who we're including and who we're excluding in that discourse. Sorry, that's the professor in me around religion, so go ahead.
This questioner is curious about peace movements within predominantly Muslim societies and wants you to share more about the Prophet Muhammad as a peacemaker.
Absolutely. So I think I wrote when I used to do national Muslim peacebuilding conferences. And one of the things that I was really, really touched by was I developed a kind of class on 10 conflict resolution skills of Prophet Muhammad. I'm also a mediator, so I've taught, 30-hour courses. And one of the things that I was really struck with about Prophet Muhammad's example of peacemaking was particularly that this idea of anger was not a virtue. And some of the sayings I'll just share with you, some of the sayings were that in terms of true leadership, it's not the domination over the others, it's the ability to restrain your anger. That the way, there's another saying where a person comes to the prophet and asks what is the best form of exertion, of spiritual exertion, and Prophet Muhammad says to speak a word of truth in front of a tyrant. So it's not to prosecute a war, it's not to utilize violence, but it's actually an advocacy for nonviolent direct action. So for me, I think one of the things we've been missing is the ability to have a conversation on the spiritual sources of all of our traditions in which nonviolence, but also justice go hand in hand. And I think that's one of the reasons I chose a Quaker college. In addition to, we were talking about this earlier, Bayard Rustin being a Quaker, and I don't know what I read at 17 that made me think I stayed Muslim, obviously. But the Quaker tradition for me really became this notion of an embodiment of peace building in which a community lived in nonviolence. And I think those resources are in all of our traditions. It's very important to think about the fact that the peacemakers we celebrate are all dead. Mm. Can you think of any peacemakers we celebrate that are alive? Mm. And not only dead, they're dead years ago. I didn't know or was alive at the time that any of them were around. Thinking about Gandhiji, I wasn't born at that time. I was born in South Asia. So I just want to mention this because, for instance, one of my mentors, Akil Bashir, passed away recently. He is an African-American Muslim that was one of the premier gang interventionists in Southern California. An incredible peacemaker. I was at his funeral, 500 or 600 people showed up of every background. Dr. Bashir should be a celebrated peacemaker of Muslim origin in Southern California. Do you know his name?
Well, did Muslim and Jewish dialogue and interfaith work die after October 7, 2023, with the attack on the Jewish settlement by some Hamas?
I mean, did it die in the United States? Is that the question?
The question is, perhaps how did Muslim-Jewish relationship dialogue?
I think that certainly there are incredible challenges to that work right now, and that someone doesn't like that question who's honking their horn. I do think that there have been incredible challenges, and I do think there's still, there have been, I'll just give you as an example, there have been incredible partnerships. So I'll share one of the first things that happened, I'm not sure if you're aware, but there's incredible anti-Somali rhetoric right now. And so anti-Somali rhetoric is actually anti-Muslim, anti-Black, and anti-immigrant. It's a 3-for-1 deal. You get them all together. So a story that I wanted to share is as anti-Somali rhetoric started going very high, the tensions in our neighborhood, our students began to be afraid to walk across the street to get their medicine. Our students were afraid to leave campus or their rooms. We had a meeting at a church that a pastor and an imam put together, and a rabbi came to the meeting and said, this is actually before the surge happened, and a rabbi showed up and said, I'm here because I want to support the Somali community because what's happening to them happened to my community in the past. She was talking about the carrying of papers, these kinds of realities that the community was facing. For those who don't know, the vast majority of Somalis are US citizens. So actually they're carrying papers, but they're actually citizens. And I share that story with you because I think that there are forms of dialogue and there are also forms of action, and that we are still showing up for one another in ways that may not be told yet, and in ways that may not be safe to share, but they are happening. And that part of the rehumanization is being able to see the spaces in which resources of different communities are being shared. Some of the most important immigration protection work is happening by organizations from Jewish communities, and many of the immigrants who are being resettled are Muslim. So I think there are many stories to tell, and I'm not trying to point out a Pollyannish, I don't get a lot of American idioms correct because I used to say the cat race. I found out I think it's the rat race, but because I was raised with other idioms and other languages. So I want to share those stories because I do think it's important that we think about ways in which people are showing up for one another in ways that are still material, and also address the vast difficulty and realities of what dialogue looks like in this moment between these two communities, and recognize that people are still also showing up, because that's part of the rehumanization narrative with one another as well, that we have to hold the awkwardness, the difficulty, the reality, with also the fact that these things are happening, and it's not an either or.
The question here, science has the ability to
Oh boy, it starts with science. Okay, go ahead. This is
or the scientific method.
Neil deGrasse Tyson is already gone, you guys. Okay.
But science has the capacity to self-critique because of a search for truth. How can religions critique themselves when they believe they already have the truth?
This is something I was thinking when I was walking. There's a little bit of forest somewhere, and I was thinking about how do we engage in that self-critique? And in the Muslim tradition, one of the highest forms of a believer is aqil. Aqala, the triliteral root, Arabic similar to Hebrew has the triliteral root as the foundation of grammar. The aqil is someone who utilizes the rational capacity for choice as part of their religious exertion and interpretation. So if one is religious, but you blindly follow teachings, you don't ask questions, you don't inquire, you don't utilize other forms of knowledge, one of the things that has been interestingly difficult when we have, for instance, removed seminary education from science education, we've taken religion out of the educational systems of higher education, and this has happened all over the world. The secular, scientific, many of the great Muslim scientists were also great theologians. And in fact, that's the case in Christianity and other traditions as well. Once we began to separate out these forms of knowledge as if they're completely independent of one another, we forget the role of the aqala, of the aqil, of the rational part. And to me, that is the gift that God gave each of us. That's what the Quran tells us. The ability to discern right from wrong is a human capacity. It's not one that's inherent only to Muslims. It's something that each one of us is born with. So I would say that we need to also struggle with the traditions in a way that reminds us that questioning, that engaging with the texts, the Havruta reading of Jewish scriptural texts is such a beautiful tradition to watch and engage and see. And that was how many of our religious traditions engage our texts. It wasn't a singular scholar. It was done in community. That's why I remind us that this notion of community as scholars, me engaging with Glenn and what that produced, that when we work together and think about scholarship as a collective endeavor, it allows for us to build that self-critical perspective. And that's why interfaith engagement is also important, because it's, when my son has to explain why he doesn't eat pork at 5 years old to someone, that means he was so excited when he had a Jewish student in his class because he was like, someone else that can't eat pepperoni or something. I don't know which movement that person was a part of, but it was very exciting for 2 5-year-olds. So I share that because I think when we began to isolate ourselves from one another is when we also move away from that self-critical perspective, because nobody's asking us questions.
Knowing that religion itself can cause so much conflict and division, why should someone be religious?
I feel like that's a question between you and the divine or not divine. But I think one of the things, thinking about the work of The Myth of Religious Violence, a book that's really important, is it's very easy. I was brought into a major institution, I won't name it, working on a major conflict in another part of the world. And the mediators just assume that religion creates violence. And they were struck because here are people that were traumatized by another tradition or their own tradition. In fact, this is something I was talking about, the interfaith component. A lot of religious violence is not against people of other traditions. It's people within religious traditions of the same background. But they were struck, these mediators were struck that people who had experienced religious or trauma that they interpret as created by religion were still deeply spiritual and still needed religious intervention as part of their recovery and healing. So I was brought in to answer that very question: why should mediators be concerned about religion? And I raise that because what can happen is we can see religion as only an agent of chaos, but it's also been an incredible agent of peace. It's been an agent in which I do restorative justice work. It is far easier for many people who have a spiritual bond to be able to forgive when they have that spiritual tradition. So why be religious? I think that's an individual question, but we want to be very careful that we also diagnose the reasons for difficulty and conflict, some as religious, but others can be, one of the biggest is economic disparity in a society, lack of access to natural resources, and that sometimes we put the veil of religion on those causes and we misdiagnose why people are in conflict. So I think it's really important to be diagnostically correct. And I think it's also important to understand that as much as people might want to stamp out religion, for many people, recovery is still deeply connected to a spiritual path. And that is the reality that shows up again and again. I'll give you one last example. After the tsunami, I don't remember what year, there were many therapists that wanted to be dispatched to go out and deal with issues of recovery. And local communities said, we want to engage our spiritual leaders in rituals of recovery and healing. What are you talking about? I'm going to talk to this guy I don't know. Who is this person? I don't, so people have systems of healing and rituals of recovery that are very important to them as well. So I think what I always tell people is religion and religions have the capacity to hurt and they have the capacity to heal. And being aware of both of those dynamics as coexisting in the same moment, maybe even in the same person. You could be pushed out of your religious community for whatever reason and still have a yearning for that spiritual tradition and being able to hold all of that in one person. Because I think we have to also be careful not to say that religion is a panacea for all problems. Religion has created trauma for many people, maybe even in this space. I was going to say in this room, but we're outdoors. So in this tent, that seems permanent.
The Hall of Philosophy. Is it true that your father, Syeed, spoke here years ago? Do you
Is
know
that a question you just came up with yourself?
It's right here.
Oh, yes, he did. I think that was the part that was supposed to make it into the introduction. But
Yes. Is it true your father spoke here? And do you know, what did he think of Chautauqua then? Do you know?
he is having major the FOMO, fear of missing out. He wishes he could be here. My mother had a stroke about 8 years ago, so it's very hard for her to travel. But he felt so welcome, and apparently he was allowed to stay for a whole week. I brought my mom. So I just want to say things might have changed in the last 30 years. Only here for a day and a half.
Yeah. Do you?
Sorry. Okay.
We've got an extra room ready.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
right,
okay.
we're
Thank
ready.
you.
Can you suggest a first step? How might we make a first step to bridging the gap between faiths especially in such a politically divided country?
So at no moment has America been more divided, and at no moment has it been more diverse. I want you to hold those together. So we are deeply divided, but we are also deeply diverse. And so I say that because I think that's the promise of the United States, with all of the complex, continuous, historical traumas and realities that have been a part of this history. And I mention that because part of that religious diversity is deeply connected to immigration. So I want to put that out there. And because I mentioned earlier in the history of the United States, I mention that because I think one of the things we have to begin to think about is, do we want a country? I don't remember what the question was. So do we want a country?
It's blowing in the wind.
It's blowing in the wind. What's that? I'm still thinking about that week, yeah. Although if it's this hot all the time, I might pick an earlier time in the summer. But
you were talking on
I do.
What tips can you give us?
So the tips that I would have is that we have to, first of all, embrace that awkward space. We have to also ask ourselves, what is the incentive and the benefit of engaging across difference? I think that has to be a real question. It's not just the moral and ethical imperative to do so, but thinking about the notion of engaging across difference, there are sociological, economic benefits. Just as we think about immigration policy, there are towns in this country that are alive because of immigration in the last 40 or 50 years, beginning to reframe fear and division into what is, and I say common good here, not just from the theological perspective, but I think one of the things religious people do sometimes is not speak the language that people are bringing to the table. It took me about 3 years of dialogue between two communities in a part, this was around, I used to do a lot of gang violence intervention, between two communities that were told or felt that the resources of that city, that they were competing for them. That was the narrative that they were told about each other. And one of the questions, so there are about 4 questions that I ask when I engage in conflict intervention. The first question is, are we in each other's futures? Do you want to be in each other's futures? That's the first question. The second question I ask is, who is human? Because we have to work on the realities of dehumanization that people are showing up with. The third question is, who is benefiting from you being in conflict? So that third question related to these two communities that took 2 or 3 years of dialogue is, who is benefiting from you all being in conflict? And the switch turned when the realization is that neither of them were benefiting, and in fact, there are other forces that were benefiting from keeping them in conflict.
Yes.
So those are 3 questions that I would think about as you build and engage. And the fourth thing that I would say is to be really honest about the objectives for the conversation. One of the difficult questions or questions we had earlier is, are we getting together to solve a world problem? Is that the object of the dialogue when people are not even in relationship with one another? So I think we have to be very honest, very clear, very transparent. And the last thing is, I would say, whomever we're having dialogue with should be involved in the design of the dialogue.
Yes.
I think one of the things we saw with Muslim communities after 9/11, because of the targeting, was design of these dialogues and then just show up. We saw a breakdown of interracial dialogues in the 80s and 90s because there were these dialogues that were created where people from people who were dealing with real racism were showing up, and it was just conversation. And you're not going to be invested in a dialogue if there isn't an outcome that is actually going to transform the conditions that inform whatever it is that you are being targeted for. So those are some of the things that, as we design dialogue, have partners in the process of designing full partners.
Okay.
See, Rob, I'm outlining what you need to do in the next few years. Just,
Yeah,
okay.
And now, time for just two more questions, two short questions, both personal. How does your personal Muslim faith energize you to do the work you are doing?
Well, we all survive 1 month of fasting. From the age of puberty, similar to Judaism, we become adults at the age of puberty religiously. No, it's not a joke, actually. Spiritual discipline, one thing I learned about was that there are acts of spiritual discipline, and someone was asking me why be religious. It's the act of doing spiritual rituals and discipline in community together that creates strength. I mean, that's why you see the beauty of people who go through struggles. They can withstand struggles, they can withstand hunger, and part of that is that spiritual design. Unfortunately, it creates a kind of rabidness as well that can go in a different direction, right? And that's why the power of religion in general is so potent. For me personally, I think as a Muslim, what has been really important has been this notion of the idea that there is a constant tazkiyatun nafs, which means a cleansing of the soul. So I think of the work that I do as a consistent internal struggle. So for Muslims, a lot of our struggle is not with the world, it's the internal exertion spiritually to make choices that help forward the purity of our soul and not the detriment or the destruction of our soul, which lack compassion or rahmah for others.
I think we should end there.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Syeed.